In the autumn of 1908, a crew of 5 men tearing down the last standing cabin on what had once been the Ravenel Bluff plantation in the South Carolina Low Country swung their crowbars into a wall that had been nailed shut, tarred over, and whitewashed 3 times in 45 years. The man who had ordered it sealed in March of 1863 was long dead. His widow had died the winter before. The deed to the property had passed through 4 hands, each new owner assured by the Ravenel family's former overseer that the little cabin at the edge of the rice field could be demolished, but never, under any circumstance, opened. When the first board came loose that October afternoon, the foreman stepped back from the smell that rolled out into the pine-heavy air. 2 of the younger workers crossed themselves. The oldest man among them, a freedman named Solomon Pinckney, who had been born on a neighboring plantation in 1847, set down his crowbar and said, very quietly, that he had been waiting 60 years to know what was on the other side of that wall. What they found inside that cabin would force a county coroner out of retirement, produce a series of newspaper articles that were pulled from print within 3 weeks, and reveal a crime that the Ravenel family had spent 2 generations and a small fortune trying to bury behind pine boards and Sunday piety. Before we continue with the story of Ravenel Bluff and the cabin that was sealed since 1863, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from right now. Hearing from you across the country reminds me why these stories must never be forgotten. And now, to understand what lay behind that wall, we have to go back to the spring of 1849, when Ravenel Bluff was still considered one of the most prosperous rice plantations along the tidal stretch of the Combahee River. The plantation sat on a high bank of sandy loam that overlooked nearly 300 acres of flooded rice fields, bordered to the east by a dense stand of cypress and live oak draped in Spanish moss, and to the west by a low tidal creek that filled and drained with the salt-pulled rhythm of the Atlantic. The air in the low country that spring was thick with the smell of mud and blooming jessamine. And at night, the rice fields filled with the croaking of bullfrogs and the slow, steady clicking of the rice birds that came down from the Carolina Piedmont to feed on the spring plantings. To the north, the Combahee River moved between its banks of blackwater and tangled palmetto, its surface broken every few yards by the log-still shapes of alligators sunning themselves in the long afternoon light. It was, in the geography of the antebellum South, one of the richest stretches of land in the Republic. A single acre of Combahee rice, at the price it commanded in the Charleston markets of 1849, was worth more than most free white farmers in the upcountry earned in a year. The main house was a 2-story Greek Revival structure, painted the particular shade of white that only the very wealthy could afford to maintain in that humid climate. Its columns were carved from hard pine, and its long verandas were shaded by the same live oaks that had been old when the first European settlers passed through the region in the 1690s. The interior was furnished with pieces that Augustine Ravenel's grandfather had shipped from Philadelphia and New Orleans: mahogany writing desks, a broadwood pianoforte in the front parlor, a sideboard of French walnut that had been carried down from Richmond on a coastal schooner in 1811. The floors were hard pine, the walls were plastered and painted the color of old cream. Behind the main house, arranged in a neat double row along a packed earth lane, stood the plantation's 12 slave cabins. They were small structures of rough-cut cypress plank roofed with hand-split shingles, each one housing between 4 and 8 human beings who were considered, under the laws of South Carolina in that year, the personal property of Mr. Augustine Ravenel. The cabins had packed earth floors, a single hearth at one end, and small unglazed windows covered at night with oiled cloth. In the summer, they were thick with the smell of sweat and smoke and the resinous breath of the pine forest beyond the fence. In the winter, they were cold enough that the children slept 3 to a pallet for warmth. Between the cabins and the main house ran an invisible line that every person on the plantation understood without ever having to have it explained. One side of that line was the world of the Ravenel family, the world of ledger books and Sunday dinners and letters written on cream-laid paper. The other side was the world of work and survival, and the long memory of a people who had been brought to that place from a continent that most of them had never seen and would never see again. Augustine Ravenel was 46 years old in the spring of 1849. He was the third of his family to hold the plantation, descended from a Huguenot merchant who had fled France in the 1680s and settled in Charleston before pushing inland to the rice country. Augustine was a tall, narrow-shouldered man with sand-colored hair going gray at the temples, and a habit, noted by every neighbor who ever had supper at his table, of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was displeased. His wife, Henrietta Bonneau Ravenel, was 7 years his junior, educated in the French manner at a finishing school in Charleston, and known among the wives of the Low Country gentry for her fierce adherence to the proprieties of her class. They had 3 children, a daughter, Clotilda, who was 12 in that spring, a son, Augustine Jr., who was 9, and a younger boy, Lawrence, who was 4. The plantation held, by the census of that year, 47 enslaved people. Among them were a man named Ezekiel, who was the head driver of the field hands and who had been born on the plantation in 1809, and whose father before him had been brought in chains from the windward coast of Africa in 1787. Ezekiel knew every inch of the rice fields, every working of the trunk gates that controlled the tidal flow, every name of every person who lived in the cabins. He was, in the unspoken hierarchy of the enslaved community, the man to whom the others turned when a child fell ill, or when a dispute needed to be settled without the involvement of the overseer. He was 40 years old in the spring of 1849, a broad-shouldered man with hands so calloused that he had lost most of the feeling in his fingertips. There was a woman named Clarissa, who ran the kitchen and was considered by Henrietta Ravenel to be indispensable. Clarissa was 52 in that spring. She had been a girl of 8 when she was bought by Colonel Pierre Ravenel at the Charleston market in 1805, separated on that same afternoon from her mother, whose name she could no longer remember by the time she reached middle age. Clarissa had, over the decades, made herself into the most skilled cook in the parish. Her shrimp pillau was famous from Beaufort to Charleston. She baked Benny wafers that Henrietta served to the visiting wives of state senators. She knew every herb that grew in the kitchen garden, every remedy for a child's fever, every measure of every ingredient in every recipe she had ever learned. And she knew, too, how to listen. The kitchen was the place where the main house and the quarters met, and Clarissa had spent 44 years of her life standing at that intersection, hearing everything that passed between the two worlds and remembering it. And there was a young woman named Delia, who was 18 years old in that spring, and whose mother had died of the fever the year before. Delia had been assigned to the main house, where she served as nursery maid to the youngest Ravenel child. She was tall for a woman of her time, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed older than her years, and a careful stillness about her that her fellow servants had learned to respect. She did not speak unless addressed. She did not laugh where it could be heard. But she sang very softly to the little boy Lawrence when she put him to sleep at night old songs in a Gullah patois that her grandmother had brought from the Sea Islands. And the child would fall asleep with his hand curled around one of her fingers as if he had always known her. Delia's grandmother, whose name had been Bina, had told her as a child that the songs were older than any of them, older than the plantations, older than the ships. And that as long as there was a child in the world who could still hear them, they would not die. Delia had believed her. Singing those songs over the cradle of a white child who was not her own was, in some private corner of her mind, the only way she had of keeping her grandmother alive. This was the ordinary world of Ravenel Bluff in the spring of 1849. A world of rice and rhetoric, of mint juleps on the veranda and Sunday sermons at the parish church in Beaufort district, of neat ledger books in Augustine study recording every bushel and every birth and every purchase, both of livestock and of people. It was a world that its inhabitants believed would last forever. It was a world that was about to crack open along a seam that no one in the main house had yet seen. The crack began in the summer of 1852 when Augustine Ravenel's youngest son, Lawrence, died of yellow fever. He was 7 years old. The fever came that summer to Beaufort district in one of the worst outbreaks the region had seen since the epidemic of 1817. It moved through the low-lying plantations along the Combahee River the way fever had always moved in that country, through the mosquito-thick air of the August dusk, striking the youngest and the oldest first. At Ravenel Bluff, it took 3 people in the course of 2 weeks. An elderly field hand named Old Moses died on the 11th of August. A 4-year-old girl in the second cabin died on the 15th. And on the morning of the 21st, little Lawrence Ravenel woke with a flushed face and a temperature that made Delia's hand jerk back when she touched his forehead. The boy lasted 8 days. For the first 3, he alternated between fever and shivering, asking for his mother, who could not be reached in time, and for Delia, who did not leave his side. By the 5th day, the disease had entered its second phase, the yellowing of his eyes, the retching of black matter that gave yellow fever its old name of vomito negro. Delia, who was 21 years old, held him through each convulsion with a steadiness that the household physician later described in a letter to Henrietta Ravenel as remarkable. When Lawrence could no longer speak, Delia held his hand and sang to him the same song she had sung when he was an infant. She sang about the river that ran to the sea. She sang about the woman who became a bird. She sang until her voice gave out, and then she hummed. And then she simply held him. Henrietta Ravenel was in Charleston when the child died, visiting her sister. Augustine was in the study. It was Delia who closed the boy's eyes and who washed his small body with rosewater and who wrapped him in the linen that had been set aside for the purpose and who did not cry in front of the physician because she knew that no one in the main house would ask her to. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the main house. Henrietta returned from Charleston 3 days after her son's burial, collapsed in the front hall of the plantation house, and had to be carried upstairs. She did not leave her bedroom for nearly 4 months. The curtains of the nursery were drawn. The toys were wrapped in muslin and packed away in a trunk. The house was draped in black crepe and the mirrors were turned to the wall. And the mantel clocks were stopped at the hour of the boy's death. Augustine, who had been distant from his children for most of their lives, began to spend long hours in the nursery where his youngest son had died, sitting in the rocking chair Delia had once used. He drank more than he had ever drunk before. He slept badly. He snapped at his daughter, Clotilda, who was 15 that summer and who had begun to fear her father in a way she had never feared him. And Delia, who had nowhere else to go, was often in that same nursery, folding small clothes that would never be worn again, dusting a rocking horse that would never be ridden. What happened between them in that nursery over the course of the next year did not happen because either of them chose it in any sense that a free person would recognize as choice. Augustine Ravenel was the man who owned her. Under the laws of South Carolina in 1852, there was no such thing as the rape of an enslaved woman by her enslaver, because the word rape required a violation of the victim's will, and the law did not recognize that an enslaved woman possessed a will that could be violated. This was not a private opinion of the Ravenel family. It was the written law of the state, upheld by every court in the Republic south of the Mason-Dixon line. And it had been articulated, most infamously, by Judge Thomas Ruffin of North Carolina in the case of State v. Mann in 1829, when the judge had written that the power of the master must be absolute in order to render the submission of the slave perfect. And it was under the cover of that law, and under the cover of his wife's grief, and under the cover of the quiet rooms of a house draped in mourning cloth, that Augustine Ravenel began a relationship with the young woman who had held his dying son. Delia did not fight him. A woman in her position did not fight, because a woman in her position who fought would be whipped or sold or worse. She did what she had always done. She went still. She went silent. She sang in her own mind one of her grandmother's old songs. And she waited for it to be over. When she walked back to her cabin afterward in the darkness of the lane between the quarters, she walked without making any sound at all. She had learned, by the age of 22, that the body was a thing that could be separated from the self if you were careful, if you were very careful. And if you kept singing. In the autumn of 1853, Delia was pregnant. She was 22 years old. She told no one. And the other women in the cabin saw the shape of her body changing under her apron and knew, the way women have always known. Clarissa, who ran the kitchen, took her aside one evening behind the smokehouse and asked her whose it was. Delia did not answer. She did not have to. Clarissa had lived on Ravenel Bluff for 31 years. She had seen this before. She had seen what happened to the women it happened to. And she had seen what happened to the children. Clarissa, who had buried 3 of her own children and had watched a 4th sold away to a plantation in Alabama when the girl was 12 years old, looked at Delia for a long time in the red light of the setting sun. And then she took the younger woman's hand in her own. And she said that whatever happened, she would help her. She said it quietly. She said it once. And then she went back to the kitchen. And she did not speak of it again. The child was born in the spring of 1854 in the slave quarters, in the smallest cabin at the end of the row, which had been given to Delia after her mother's death. The midwife was an elderly woman named Grace, who had delivered more than 100 babies on that plantation and the surrounding ones over the course of her lone life. The labor was long. Delia made almost no sound. When the child came at last, just before dawn on a morning in early April, he came quietly, with his eyes open, looking at the lantern as if he had been expecting it. It was a boy. Delia named him Isaac, after her grandfather, who had been brought to the Sea Islands on a ship whose name no one in his family had ever known. The child was light-skinned, with hair the color of wet sand and eyes that would, as he grew, turn the same pale gray as Augustine Ravenel's. When Grace saw the child, she looked at Delia and did not need to ask. She washed the baby in a basin of warm water, wrapped him in a clean linen cloth, and placed him in his mother's arms. Then she sat down on the wooden stool beside the bed. And she said, very softly, that the child had the look of someone whose life would need to be guarded carefully. Delia nodded. She already knew. Henrietta Ravenel knew, too. She could not know. The child was too obvious and the plantation was too small, and the eyes of the other servants were too knowing for her to pretend otherwise. For several weeks after Isaac's birth, Henrietta did not come down to breakfast. When she finally did, on a morning in late April, she did not speak to her husband across the table. She did not speak to him in any meaningful way for almost a year. But Henrietta was a woman of her class and her time. And the solution to a problem of this kind, among the planter families of the Low Country, was not to acknowledge it. Divorce was impossible. Scandal was unthinkable. The solution was to keep the mother in the cabin at the far end of the row, to pretend that the child belonged to some unnamed field hand, and to wait for the years to soften the outline of the resemblance into something that could be politely ignored. And for 8 years, that was what they did. Delia raised Isaac in the cabin at the end of the row. Augustine continued, intermittently and with a pattern that only Delia and Clarissa would have recognized, to visit her. Henrietta lived in the main house and conducted her social calls and took the sacrament at the parish church and did not speak her husband's name in connection with the child in the cabin. Isaac grew. He learned to walk. He learned to talk. He learned from the other children in the quarters the careful art of becoming invisible whenever a white person passed. He was, by the time he was 7 years old, the quietest child on the plantation. But he was also, in the private geography of his mother's cabin, a child who laughed. Delia had carved out a small world for him, with Clarissa's help and with the help of the other women of the quarters, that was entirely his own. She had taught him to read in secret from a torn Bible that Clarissa had smuggled out of the main house and sewn into the lining of Delia's mattress. She had taught him to count using the dried beans in a kitchen jar. She had taught him the old songs. And she had taught him, in the careful language that an enslaved mother used to teach her son to survive, when to speak and when to be silent, when to bow his head and when to meet a white man's eyes, when to laugh and when to hold his face as still as a pond at dawn. He had, by his 8th year, learned all of these lessons. He was a quick child and a watchful one. And Delia sometimes watched him sleeping at night in the yellow light of a single tallow candle and thought, with a kind of grief that she did not have a word for, that he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And that the world into which he had been born was going to destroy him. And that she could not imagine a future in which this would not be true. And then, in the summer of 1862, everything changed. The war had come to the Sea Islands. The Union Navy had taken Port Royal the previous November, landing troops on Hilton Head and the surrounding islands, and sending the white population of the region fleeing toward the interior. Confederate planters up and down the coast were beginning to understand that their world was ending. The great plantations of the Sea Islands had been abandoned. The enslaved people left behind had been declared contraband of war by General Benjamin Butler. And then, in January of 1863, declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. News of all of this reached the plantations along the Combahee River through channels that the planters could not control. It reached the kitchens. It reached the stables. It reached, within days, the cabins. Augustine Ravenel, who was now 59 and who had lost 30 pounds in the last year, began to drink in the evenings in a way that his wife and daughter pretended not to notice. He began to sit up late in his study with the ledgers open in front of him, staring at columns of figures that represented a form of wealth that was, he now understood, about to be taken from him. The field hands were beginning to disappear, slipping away at night toward the Union lines, and no amount of patrolling could stop them. In April of 1862, 3 young men from the second cabin had left together and were never heard from again. In June, a woman named Hannah and her 2 daughters had simply not been in their cabin when the bell rang at dawn. Ezekiel, the head driver, who had been with the family since before Augustine inherited the plantation, walked into the woods on the night of August 9, 1862, and never came back. Augustine Ravenel began to be afraid. It was a specific, nameable fear. He was afraid of what would happen when the Union Army came, and he knew now that it would come. He was afraid of his ledgers being read by Yankee officers. He was afraid of his neighbors, several of whom had already begun to whisper about him in Beaufort society, about the child at the end of the quarters row, about the resemblance that was no longer deniable as the boy grew older. And in a way that he had not previously permitted himself to think, he was afraid of Delia and of the child Isaac, who was now 8 years old, and whose face was a daily public record of something that Henrietta had spent 9 years pretending did not exist. The war was about to make Delia a free woman, and a free Delia could testify. A free Delia could write her own name if she chose, on a piece of paper that any Union officer in the region would read with interest. A free Delia, holding the hand of a light-skinned boy whose features mirrored one of the most prominent planters on the Combahee, was no longer a private shame to be managed behind a plank wall. She was a witness. And witnesses, in the calculation of a man like Augustine Ravenel, were not problems to be reasoned with. They were problems to be solved. In the autumn of 1862, Augustine Ravenel began to make arrangements. He told his wife, one evening in October, that Delia had grown insolent, and that it was time to sell her away. Henrietta, who had been waiting for this conversation for 9 years, did not argue. She asked only that it be done quickly, and that the child go with her. Augustine agreed. He did not, however, make contact with any slave trader. The ports were blockaded. The auction houses in Charleston were empty. And Augustine had begun, in the long evenings of that autumn, to calculate a different sort of arithmetic. What happened next is the heart of what the men found behind the wall in 1908. And it is the part of this story that the Ravenel family spent 45 years and 2 generations trying to hide. I want to pause here for a moment to ask you, if this story is pulling you in, to hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts so far. The algorithm only shows these stories to more people when you engage. And there are descendants of families like Delia's all across this country who deserve to have their histories heard. Keep watching, because what I am about to tell you is the piece of the story that Augustine Ravenel paid to keep buried. On the night of January 17, 1863, according to the testimony that Solomon Pinckney would give to the Beaufort County coroner on October 29, 1908, Augustine Ravenel came to the cabin at the end of the row with a bottle of imported French brandy, a folded document bearing the seal of a Charleston notary, and 2 men from a neighboring plantation whom Solomon did not recognize. Solomon was 15 years old at the time. He was in the neighboring cabin, separated from Delia's by a single plank wall, and he heard everything. His grandmother, a woman named Flora, who had raised him after the death of his mother, was asleep on the other side of the small room, worn down by a cough that would kill her before the end of that winter. Solomon was wide awake. He had been wide awake on most of the nights of that January. He was a boy who listened. Augustine told Delia that he had purchased her freedom. He showed her the notarized document. He told her that he had arranged for her and the boy Isaac to be taken by wagon that night to a safe house in Walterboro, and from there to Charleston, where they would board a ship bound for Liverpool. He said the war would be over soon, and that she could not be here when it ended. He said he had provided a sum of money sufficient to begin a new life. He asked her to pack what she needed and to wake the boy. Solomon, through the wall, heard Augustine's voice. He heard it clearly. It was the voice of a man who was trying to sound generous, and who was, at the same time, trying to sound like a man who had made a decision he did not intend to unmake. Solomon had heard that voice many times in his short life. It was the voice that white men used when they had already decided the outcome of a conversation, and it did not matter what the other person said. Delia did as she was told. Solomon heard her through the wall, moving quietly in the dark, telling the child, in that low singing voice, that they were going on a journey, that he should be brave, that he should be very quiet. Solomon heard her wrap a small bundle of clothes. He heard her strike a match to light the stub of a candle so that she could find the child's shoes. He heard the child ask if they were going to see the ocean. He heard her say yes, they were going to see the ocean. Solomon, in the dark of his own cabin, began to pray. He did not know precisely why. He could not have articulated what was wrong himself, but something in the arrangement of voices on the other side of the wall had set a cold weight in his chest that would not lift. Then Solomon heard the two men from the neighboring plantation come into the cabin. What happened in that cabin in the next half hour is the thing that the wall was built to hide. Solomon, through the plank wall, heard it all. He heard the child cry out once, a small, high sound of surprise more than fear, because the child had not yet understood what was about to happen. He heard Delia scream. It was a single scream, cut short. He heard a sound he would not be able to describe to the coroner 45 years later without stopping and asking for water. A heavy sound. A wet sound. And then a second, smaller version of the same sound. And then, for a very long time, silence. Solomon did not move. His grandmother slept on through all of it, because she was old and her cough had exhausted her, and because the human body will sometimes refuse, at the end of a long life, to wake for sounds that the waking mind could not survive. Solomon lay in the dark with the cold weight in his chest, and he did not cry, and he did not move, and he listened to the silence on the other side of the wall as if he could, by listening hard enough, will the silence to become something else. It did not. Before dawn, Augustine Ravenel and the two men left the cabin. They went to the carriage house. They returned with tools. For the rest of that night and into the gray of the next morning, Solomon listened through the wall to the sound of hammers, of boards being nailed across the inside of the door, of tar being brushed over the seams, and of a wooden bar being driven across the outside of the cabin and sealed with nails as long as a man's hand. When Solomon dared, near noon, to look out through an odd hole in his own cabin wall, he saw three men whitewashing the exterior of the sealed cabin with a slurry of lime and pine tar. Their faces were set in a way that told him, even at 15, that they were not men who had done something they would admit to in daylight. Augustine Ravenel told the remaining enslaved people on the plantation that Delia and her boy had been sold in the night to a trader bound for Cuba. He said the cabin had been sealed because of fever. He said no one was to go near it. He said anyone caught near that cabin would be whipped within an inch of their life. And then, because the war was coming and there was no time for sentiment, he moved on. 6 months later, in July of 1863, Augustine Ravenel was dead. He had been thrown from a horse on the river road, his neck broken against a fence post, and he had died where he fell, with no last confession, no last arrangement, no last alteration to the will he had signed in 1861. His widow Henrietta inherited the plantation. The Union Army reached the Combahee River in the late summer of that year, during the raid led by Harriet Tubman and Colonel James Montgomery, and 32 of the remaining 39 enslaved people at Ravenel Bluff walked away toward the gunboats and were free. Solomon Pinckney was among them. He was 15 years old. For the next 45 years, the sealed cabin at the end of the row stood where Augustine Ravenel had left it. Henrietta Ravenel, who lived until the winter of 1907, never spoke of it. Her surviving children, Clotilda and Augustine Jr., grew up knowing only that their father had ordered the cabin sealed because of fever and that it was not to be touched. When Clotilda married a Charleston physician in 1868 and moved away, she did not look back at it. When Augustine Jr. inherited the plantation in his mother's last years, he did not look at it either. The cabin was whitewashed a second time in 1881 during a general repainting of the outbuildings, and a third time in 1899, when the plantation was first put up for sale. Each time, the workmen were told by the estate's overseer that the cabin was to be painted over, but never opened. When the crew finally broke through that wall in October of 1908, they found what Solomon had known was there all along. The remains of a woman and a child, arranged on an iron bed frame as if they had been placed there with care. A notarized bill of manumission dated January 15, 1863, granting freedom to Delia and her son Isaac. A leather pouch containing 37 silver coins. And a child's wooden horse, carved by hand from live oak, with the initials IR scratched into the underside. Solomon Pinckney, who was 76 years old, told the coroner what he had heard through the wall on the night of January 17, 1863. He told it slowly, in the same careful voice he had used to speak to white men all his life. He named the men. He described the sounds. He described, with an accuracy that would later be corroborated by the coroner's findings, exactly where the bodies had been placed on the bed, and which one had been killed first, and how he knew. The investigation that followed lasted exactly 17 days. And then it was over. The story disappeared from the newspapers. The case file could not be located. The Ravenel family, through mechanisms that were never documented, made the story go away. But they could not make Solomon Pinckney go away. He lived until 1927, and in the last decades of his life, he told the story to anyone who would listen, to his children and his grandchildren, to the members of his church, to a young graduate student from Fisk University who was traveling through the Lowcountry collecting oral histories. Solomon insisted, every time he told it, on 3 points. The first was that Delia had been told she was being freed and that she had believed it until the moment the other 2 men came into the cabin. The second was that the child, Isaac, had died knowing he was being taken to see the ocean. And the third was that Augustine Ravenel had sealed the cabin not out of shame, but out of calculation. He had sealed it because a living woman and a living child, both free and both carrying the evidence of his paternity, could destroy him and his family in a way that the corpses behind a plank wall never could. Augustine Ravenel had murdered them not to hide the evidence of his crimes against Delia. He had murdered them because the imminent arrival of the Union Army was about to make her testimony and her son's face into weapons that could be used against him in a court of law and in the court of public opinion. The manumission paper had been real. He had paid to have it drawn up. He had gone through the legal motions of freeing them. And then, on the night he had promised them freedom, he had killed them. The paper in the cabin was not evidence of a generous impulse gone wrong. It was evidence of a trap set with care. Delia had believed she was free because Augustine Ravenel had shown her the paper and let her read it. And then, once she had believed it, once she had woken her son and told him they were going to see the ocean, he had let in the men who would make certain that no such journey would ever be taken. In 2003, after years of legal wrangling, the remains of Delia and Isaac were disinterred and reburied with headstones. The headstones are plain gray granite, each carved with a single name and, for the first time in either of their lives, a date of death. Delia, 1841 to January 17, 1863. Isaac, 1854 to January 17, 1863. Alongside them is a third stone added by the Pinckney family in 2004, which reads, in simple lettering, they were told they were free. He lied. Solomon Pinckney heard it through the wall and remembered. The cabin at Ravenel Bluff is only one of countless such places up and down the coast, places where the cabins have all been torn down and the fields have grown up in pine, and where, behind the polite historical markers, there are stories that were sealed in darkness by men who thought they could outlast the memory of what they had done. Some of those stories have come out. Most of them have not. And if the story of Delia and Isaac proves anything, it proves that walls do not hold forever, that the men who build them die, and that the voices they tried to silence have a way of reaching the next generation, and the generation after that, through the patience of witnesses like Solomon Pinckney, who listened through a plank wall at the age of 15, and carried what he heard for 60 years until the daylight came. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that every wall eventually falls? Or do you think there are crimes that will stay buried forever? Leave your comment below, ***. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who understands that American history is not only what was written in the ledgers, but also what was whispered through the walls, ***. See you in the next video.